License, registration, or just some good excuses, old man? That's what the young officer sneered as he circled the rusted-out Chevy pickup, chuckling with his partner like they'd already decided this traffic stop was a joke. The driver didn't flinch. He didn't argue, didn't even raise his voice. He kept both hands on the steering wheel, steady, silent, and scarred. 60 minutes later, a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop beside them. And when the four-star general stepped out, he didn't salute. He didn't hesitate. He pointed at the officers and said 6 words that shattered the moment like a thunderclap. "You just stopped the man who trained me." If that hit you deep, comment respect for every quiet legend still walking among us. Harold Briggs, 82 years old, was just heading home from the hardware store that morning. His old Chevy truck, held together with bolts and stories, rattled with every turn. But it ran because he had built it, piece by piece, in a time when quality meant survival. He wore a faded flannel shirt, old jeans, and a cap with worn embroidery. U.S. Army Special Forces. Most people didn't notice Harold. That's how he preferred it. That morning, he'd bought parts to fix a neighbor's wheelchair ramp. No charge, just something he did for the folks around Maple and Pine. A mile from his house, red and blue lights flared behind him. Calmly, Harold pulled over, placing his hands on the wheel the way he'd always taught young soldiers to do. Visible, respectful, controlled. 2 young officers approached. One tapped the hood dismissively. "No plates, no tags, driving a pile of junk," he muttered. The other smirked and leaned in. "Probably unregistered or stolen." "What do you think, old man?" Harold's voice was low, unshaken. "It's mine, since 1968. "Got ID?" one snapped. He handed it over. They scoffed. "Retired? Yeah, sure, sit tight." Then, without much thought, they pulled him out of the truck. One laughed. "You sure you're not hauling moonshine in that thing?" Harold said nothing. The officers circled the truck, fingers trailing across its rust and dents. Each mark was a memory. Afghanistan, 1978. Colombia, 1983. Places and missions that never officially existed, but the damage was real. The stories lived in Harold's bones. "Step over here, sir," one officer said, the word sir laced with mockery. Harold complied. His movements were slow, measured. He knew better than to resist. Years in combat zones had taught him that aggression only made things worse. He had nowhere urgent to be, and patience was a virtue ingrained deeper than any scar. "What's in the back?" The taller officer gestured to the supplies. "Wheelchair ramp materials for Mrs. Clansancy down the street." "Sure it is," the officer laughed, exchanging a glance with his partner. Harold's hands, worn and calloused, had built more than trucks. They'd constructed makeshift hospitals under fire, emergency shelters in the aftermath of storms, and yes, dozens of wheelchair ramps for veterans who couldn't make it up their own porches. But none of that mattered now. The officers made him empty his pockets. Keys, wallet, a weathered photo, a notebook filled with names, some starred, others crossed out. "What's this, some kind of code?" the officer asked, flipping through it without care. "Names of men I served with," Harold replied. The officer tossed it back with a shrug. "Well, your truck's not road legal, that's for sure." Harold caught the notebook with the reverence of a chaplain handling scripture. He didn't bother explaining. Didn't mention that the truck had a special historical vehicle designation exempting it from certain modern regulations. He simply stood there, silent and upright, as they made him sit on the curb. Cars passed. People filmed on their phones. One officer said, "He's being uncooperative." The other added, "Might be a risk." They called it in. Possible stolen vehicle, elderly male, uncooperative tone. In Harold's pocket was a folded letter, a personal retirement note signed by the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. In his glove box, a Bronze Star certificate and a faded photo of a unit he once commanded. "This is protocol," they told him. "You understand?" He didn't answer. The longer it dragged on, the more careless they became. One kicked a tire. "Bet this guy thinks he's Rambo," he muttered. A teenager walking by took a selfie with Harold in the background and captioned it, "Grandpa's in trouble." He uploaded it without a second thought. "Should we check his meds?" the younger officer joked. "Maybe he's forgotten who he is." But Harold hadn't forgotten. His silence wasn't confusion. It was the same discipline that had once kept him alive under interrogation by men far more terrifying than these two rookies. Across the street, a gas station clerk named Mike Henderson watched. He recognized Harold instantly. He'd seen him at the VFW hall, heard him speak maybe 3 times. But when Harold talked, the whole room listened. Mike stepped behind the counter and made a call. "You're not gonna believe who they've got sitting on the curb right now," he said. "Yes, sir, Harold Briggs, the same one." 40 minutes passed. The officers sipped coffee and scrolled their phones. One leaned on the cruiser while the other sat under a tree. They checked the records. No wants, no warrants. Vehicle wasn't stolen. Just an old man with an old truck. "Let's wrap this up," the senior officer said. "Write him for expired registration, improper display of plates, and unsafe vehicle. 3 tickets? That'll cost him nearly $1,000. Rules are rules." They approached Harold again, clipboards in hand, ready to deliver fines and a bruised ego. But then came the unmistakable sound, heavy tires on sun-baked asphalt. Heads turned. A black SUV with government plates came into view. It didn't inch forward. It arrived. Purposeful. Precise. The kind of entrance Harold himself used to make. The back door opened. A tall man in full 4-star general uniform stepped out. The officers froze. "Which of you stopped this man?" he asked. The heat shimmered off the pavement. Harold sat still, his shadow stretching long behind him. The officers looked at each other nervously. We were just..." The general raised his hand to silence them. "That man, Harold Briggs, taught me how to lead," he said. "Fort Bragg, 1983. He ran recon, saved my entire squad in training when we lost signal in the swamp. We'd have died without him." Beside the general stood his aide, holding a leather portfolio embossed with the presidential seal. The aide stood at a perfect attention. The small crowd that had gathered now leaned in. Phones captured it all. A retired mail carrier whispered to his wife, "That's why I always left extra stamps for Mr. Briggs." One of the officers blinked. "We didn't know." But they should have. The signs were all there. The silence, the scars, the steel in his posture. They just never looked past the rust. They never stopped to see the quiet legend behind the old truck and the faded flannel. "You didn't ask," Harold said, his voice low but steady. The general turned to the officers, eyes unwavering. "You just disrespected a man with 3 combat tours and 40 years of service. This truck?" He gestured to the rusted Chevy. "It's part of Army history. So is he." He then turned to the growing crowd. "This," he said, voice rising, "is what happens when we stop teaching respect." A little girl near the front whispered to her mother, "Is he famous?" "No, honey," her mother replied softly. "He's more than that. He's real." One of the officers slowly removed his sunglasses. "Sir, we're sorry." Harold didn't flinch. "Don't apologize to me," he said. "Apologize to the next old man before you assume he's nothing." The general stepped forward and saluted. Harold returned it, crisp and silent. General Phillips stood ramrod straight, his 4 stars catching the midday sun. The crowd was absolutely still. No murmurs, no footsteps, not even a cough. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Sergeant Major Briggs led the operation that extracted 23 hostages from the Colombian jungle in '86, the general continued, his voice clear and strong. He returned to active duty at age 60 after 9/11 to train special operations units in advanced survival techniques. 3 presidents have shaken his hand. His mission records are sealed until 2075. The general's aide stood silently nearby, leather portfolio in hand, bearing the presidential seal. The high-altitude rescue techniques he developed saved 18 airmen in a classified operation I'm still not at liberty to name. A woman in nursing scrubs stepped forward from the crowd. Mr. Briggs donated blood every month for 30 years, she added. Never missed an appointment. The 2 officers shifted uncomfortably. The rusted truck they once mocked now stood like a relic of service, history written in every dent and weld. General Phillips placed a hand on its hood. This truck transported medical supplies during Hurricane Andrew in '92. He drove it through 4 feet of floodwater to reach stranded families. The senior officer cleared his throat. Sir, we were just following protocol. Vehicle didn't appear to be legal. The general's gaze turned sharp. Protocol is built on judgment, officer. Harold Briggs wrote the protocol for night extractions that's still used in our forces today. Harold remained silent, but those who knew him noticed the slight lift of his chin, the subtle straightening of his spine. A woman emerged from the crowd. That man built my husband's wheelchair ramp after his stroke. Wouldn't take a dime for it. Another voice. He taught my son's scout troop wilderness survival last summer. He delivers groceries to the senior center every Wednesday, said an elderly man with a cane. General Phillips nodded. Sergeant Major Briggs never stopped serving, did he? The crowd had grown to nearly 50, many filming with phones. Within minutes, the story was trending nationwide. 4-star general defends elderly vet harassed by police. The younger officer, his face red, approached Harold. Sir, I want to personally apologize for my disrespect. I didn't know. That's the point, son, Harold interrupted gently. You never know who someone is by looking at them. That's why respect comes first, not last. General Phillips reached into the aide's folder and handed a document to the senior officer. This is Sergeant Major Briggs's service record, the unclassified version. I suggest you read it before your shift ends. The officer took it with a subdued nod. As for the truck, Phillips continued, it has historical vehicle status granted by the Department of Defense. Paperwork's filed with your department annually. Maybe next time, check your records. Harold finally spoke again, calm and composed. General, these officers were doing their job as they understood it. The fault isn't entirely theirs. Explain, said the general. We've created a system where badges and uniforms matter more than the people wearing them, where protocol replaces judgment. I saw the same mistake in Vietnam, young men following orders without context. The general nodded slowly. Always the teacher, aren't you, Harold? Harold allowed himself a small smile. Until they put me in the ground, sir. That afternoon, the sheriff's department issued a public statement. The incident made national news. Legendary veteran detained general defends former mentor. The mayor declared June 4th Harold Briggs Day. Donations poured in. $247,000 in the first week alone. Harold redirected every penny toward building wheelchair ramps for disabled veterans nationwide. Thus, the Harold Briggs Initiative was born, with over 300 homes already on the waiting list for accessibility modifications. A bronze plaque was installed at the street corner where Harold had once been forced to sit on the curb. Not every uniform comes with a spotlight. But every act of service leaves a legacy. Harold kept driving that same truck, still fixed ramps, still walked the aisles of the hardware store in faded flannel. But now, when people saw him, they didn't look through him. They stepped aside, nodding with respect. Weeks later, one of the officers came to visit. I'm sorry, sir, truly. Harold poured him a cup of coffee. You learn from it, he said, or someone else pays next time. From that day forward, that officer, Brian Keller, made sure every rookie in the department read Harold's file before ever touching a badge. The change rippled outward. The video of the incident reached 8 million views. Veterans groups across the country shared similar stories. The hashtag #NeverKnowWhoYouStop went viral. But Harold, he stayed far from the noise. That summer, he quietly built his 23rd wheelchair ramp for a Gulf War vet recovering from surgery. Brian Keller didn't just apologize and disappear. He started volunteering at the VFW hall on weekends. At first, the veterans eyed him warily, the cop who disrespected one of their own. But Harold's quiet acceptance gradually opened the doors. One evening, while repairing a leaking roof on the hall, Harold looked over at Brian. "Why'd you really come back?" "Because I realized," Brian said, "I didn't know a damn thing about the people I swore to protect. 4 years on the force, and I'd never once set foot in this place." That same year, the sheriff implemented a new training module: recognition and respect, veterans in our community. Harold reluctantly agreed to speak at the first session. He said only 11 words. "Service doesn't end with the uniform. Neither should respect for it." 3 months later, General Phillips returned, this time without uniform, no entourage. He and Harold sat on the porch of Harold's modest home, sipping whiskey, watching fireflies drift through the summer air. "You turned it around, Harold, like always." Harold shook his head. "They turned it around themselves. All they needed was a mirror. That old truck still rattles down Main Street every morning. Still carries lumber, tools, and, when the occasion calls for it, a flag-draped coffin for a veteran with no family to bear him to rest. But now, when police cruisers see it, they don't pull it over. They pull over to salute. And at the police academy, every new recruit reads a laminated card bearing 6 unforgettable words. You never know who you're stopping. Subscribe to AZN Stories if you believe that true honor doesn't rust.